Hi everyone, this is our final video looking at how to revise for English language paper 1. So as I said, this is part 4. What we're going to do now is just do some last minute revision just to give you an overview of the paper before the exam. So the first thing we're going to think about is the timing when we do our exams. So the exam is 1 hour and 45 minutes long. I'd like you to think about how long you should spend on each question. So if you think about the teacher's top tip before we move on, you should make sure you are managing your time effectively within the exam. For example, question 4 and 5 have the most marks available, so you must spend enough time on these questions. And remember, if you do miss these ones out, that's really going to be detrimental to your overall grade, so please do make sure that you spend enough time on 4 and 5. Managing your timing. So in case you're unaware, this is the actual full name of the exam paper. It's called Explorations in Creative Reading and Writing. And within this exam, you would normally get 1 hour and 45 minutes. That is unless you get additional time. So for question 1, you should spend about 5 minutes on this question because it is worth 4 marks. Question 2 is worth 8 marks, so you should spend around 10 minutes. Likewise for question 3, which is our structure question. For question 4, this is worth 20 marks, so you should spend around 20 minutes on this question. And then question 5 should spend around 45 minutes on this question because it's worth 40 marks. Now this is just a very vague overview, but just keep in mind the general timing that you should think about for each question. Generally, most of us don't spend 4 minutes on question 1, so you should try and think about whether you are allotting your time appropriately to the questions that are worth the most amount of marks in the exam. So within this video then, we're going to be going over the following things. So we've just recorded the timing for each question. We're going to understand how to approach each question in a very simple breakdown, and then you're going to apply your understanding to prepare for the paper 1 exam. So first of all then, we're going to go nice and simple, and we're just going to make sure that everyone can recall each of the questions on the paper 1 exam. So for question 1, we need to be able to identify explicit information. This is also known as identifying 4 things within the text, and that is worth 4 marks. And typically this should be from about lines 1 to 5 in the actual extract. Question 2, this is identify and comment on language, and this is worth 8 marks. Question 3, identify and comment on structure, which is worth 8 marks. Question 4, now we're into our real big valuable questions now, is agree or disagree with a statement, and you need to evaluate the writer's methods in relation to a statement, and this will be 20 marks. Now, the thing to remember with this one, that even though it doesn't directly state it in the question, because it's asking us to evaluate the writer's methods, that does mean that we'd expect you to talk about language or structure for this question. And our final one, question 5, write the opening of a story or a description based on a picture, and that is worth a total of 40 marks, so we have 24 marks for content and 16 marks for technical accuracy or SPAG. So again, whenever we're going through these ones, consider how much time you should spend on each question in relation to their value. So now what we're going to do is going to look at a breakdown for each of the questions on paper 1. If you need any additional help or support, then do let us know. Any extra questions are more than welcome. Question 2. Look at the breakdown of question 2 and attempt the challenges that follow. So the question will always start with, how has the writer used language to? Now we don't know what the rest of the question is going to be like because it really does depend on the extract that you get. In the exam, you're going to have the following guidance as well. So it will say things like, you can include the writer's use of words and phrases, language features and techniques, and sentence forms. Now when it comes to writing your response, really how you structure it can vary depending on what your teacher has taught you, whether you're using a Peter, a petal, or any other of the various different forms of writing that have been used by teachers. It really doesn't matter as long as you're using these kind of things. So you need to make sure that for the 8-mark question that we write at least 2 paragraphs, identify language, techniques, and also word class. And finally, arguably the most important one here, is to comment on the effects of language. So it's all well and good if you say the writer has used a simile, that's fantastic, but what impact has this had? How does it affect our understanding, and how can it link back to the question? Now in terms of the key techniques, You should know quite a few by now, hopefully, and this is not a comprehensive list of all of them that will come up in the exam, but these are just to name a few. So some of the basic ones are things like similes, metaphors, imagery, personification, onomatopoeia, and semantic field, and as I've said before, the list does go on. Additionally, you need to think about things like word class, which are things like verbs, adverbs, nouns, and adjectives. Now, if you'd like to delve into this in more detail, please do check out our previous video that goes into question 2 in a lot more detail. Question 3. Look at the breakdown of question 3 and attempt the challenges that follow. So the question will say then, how has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? Now this is an interesting question because really we've got to play it really fast and loose with this idea of interesting. So what you've got to imagine is if you were someone who is an avid reader, how would that interest you? How would it grab your attention? In the exam, there'll be these bullet points to help you think about your response. So you could write about what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source, how and why the writer changes the focus as the source develops, and any other features that interest you. Now when you're writing your response, you need to make sure that you include the following things. We need to make sure that we write at least 2 paragraphs. Again, this is worth 8 marks, so you need to kind of balance that out accordingly. Identify structural techniques and comment on the effects. One of the big things that I heard a teacher say recently was it's all well and good saying that they've used this structural technique, but why? Or because of what? Well, how does that affect our interpretation? So again, just like with question 2, it's all about commenting on the effects of the techniques. Now, in terms of the key techniques, you might have heard of a few of these, hopefully you have, and again, it's not a comprehensive list, there are more. So we have a beginning, a shift in focus, zoom in, zoom out, foreshadowing, resolution, cliffhanger, rising and falling action. In addition, we can also comment on sentence structure, so simple, compound, and complex. And again, just like with the previous comment there on question 2, if you do want to delve into these in more depth, we've got a lot more things on previous videos if you want to go on to question 3. Question 4. Now let's look at the breakdown for this one. So the question will say, focus this part of your answer on the second part of the source, and it will specify the lines that we need to go to. Specifically, it will be round about halfway through towards the end. It's important that you actually mark these off within your exam so that you're actually getting your quotations from the right section. It will then say, a student will make a statement on what they've just read. And the first thing you need to address is whether or not you agree. So as someone who's marked exams for many, many years, the first thing I look out for when I'm doing question 4 is have they actually addressed the question and stated clearly whether they agree or disagree. Now sometimes a lot of learners use just one simple sentence. I find it's better if you kind of give us essentially a conclusion without using any quotations, but really to explain well why it is you either agree or disagree. In your response you could consider your own impressions, evaluate how the writer, and support your response with references to the text. Again, as we're talking about evaluate, that means we must make an actual judgment on the language or structural techniques that have been used by the writer. Writing your response. When writing your response, you need to make sure that you write at least 3 paragraphs. Identify the writer's methods, so language and structure. Remember to comment on the effects and link back to the question. And again, the first thing you should be doing as well when you're writing your response is answering that first part of the question. To what extent do you agree? Key techniques. So even though it doesn't explicitly mention language or structure in the question, this is an evaluation question, so you must comment on the methods. If you're not doing that, you're really going to limit the amount of marks available to you, and if you're good at doing things like question 2, for example, question 4 should be nice and straightforward for you to attempt. Now what we're going to do is think about our creative writing. So what we've got here is we've got the top end of the mark scheme. You can see there it says level 4, 19 to 24 marks. And essentially what it comes down to is these 2 things to make sure we get a good mark for AO5. So the first thing it really kind of goes into is this idea of crafting linguistic devices. So this is not just about throwing in a simile or a metaphor, but what you need to do is avoid cliches and actually craft your response by using techniques as well as ambitious vocabulary together. Next, we talk about organisation. So when you're thinking about the organisation of your writing, you need to remember to use a range of sentence structures, so simple, compound and complex. Use some of the structural techniques that you may have spoke about in question 3, so things like zooming in, zooming out, shifting focus. There's nothing wrong with doing things like a resolution or a cliffhanger as well. And also link your paragraphs. So does it flow? Does it sound like a real novel? Now if we take a look at AO6, so this is for our technical accuracy. Again, it's quite complicated here, but if we can get up to this level, that's 13 to 16 marks, will be absolutely fantastic to achieve for the creative writing. So here are a few questions to consider. Do you use punctuation where it is needed? Do you use a range of punctuation, not just the basics? So what we mean by this is that you're not just using the bog standard full stop, comma, question mark and exclamation mark. Are you using things that are a little bit more advanced, such as colons, semicolons, brackets, dashes and things like that? Do you use different sentence forms appropriately? So a good thing to think about is that if we've got something really serious you want to convey, you go with a nice, short, simple sentence. And if you're going to inspire a sense of drama or a chase or something exciting, you might want a bit more of a complex or compound sentence to get that kind of tone across. Next, are you good at spelling? So again, you do get marked on spelling for this one as well. And when you think about the next bullet point as well, are there any large or unusual words that you can spell? So if you actually have a look at the mark scheme for the bullet points, we've got things like high level of accuracy in spelling, including ambitious vocabulary, and extensive and ambitious use of vocabulary. So essentially what that's saying there is that if you use ambitious vocabulary, so the big unusual words, and you're able to spell those correctly, then that's going to allow you to get a little bit higher up there in the mark scheme. Writing exercise. So all of these scenarios have come from previous exam papers, so what I'd like you to do is pick one of the events and write a story on one of the options. So we've got things like write a story about discovering a hidden object, write a story about a human meeting an animal, write a story about an unlikely friendship, write a story about a life-saving rescue, and write a story about a new beginning. Now if you do want to practice any of these, then that's absolutely fantastic. If you are struggling to start, then look at the examples on the next slide and try and use the mark scheme to decide which one is the more effective response. So here we have our two examples then, so I'll just read through the first example for you, and I want you to use what we thought about in the actual mark scheme to decide if it's going to get an appropriate mark. So example 1. The animal looked really scruffy, like a homeless person. There was a bad smell, as horrible as sick and vomit. The dog was old and moved as slow as a snail as it went to its food bowl for food. The dog's paws were really dirty, and no one knew when it had last had a bath. Okay, so that's our first example. Example 2. Tom became transfixed as he looked into the animal's eyes. The deep blue of its iris held an ocean of understanding and care. He had never been a dog person. He had never trusted the unpredictability of an animal that spends half of its life chasing its own tail. But there was something in those eyes, something that simultaneously demanded his attention but also offered comfort to his aching heart. So if we break down the differences between the two examples, we can see there's a few errors there in example 1. There's a few errors there with homophones, so they've used the wrong words every now and again in terms of new and things like that. They have used some language techniques, but really they're undeveloped. Some of them are really kind of cliche, especially when you think about things like as slow as a snail. Yes, you are using a simile there, but it's not really going to capture anyone's imagination. Now if we look at example 2, we can see there that the person is trying to use more ambitious vocabulary with words like transfixed, simultaneously, and certain words like that. Even unpredictability is quite a difficult word to spell. We also have things like a semicolon and quite a few language techniques that are a little bit more interesting and engaging than the previous one. So in terms of the mark scheme, example 1 isn't going to score particularly high because it doesn't have a good level of language techniques, hasn't varied the vocabulary, the sentence forms aren't particularly engaging or anything like that. However, for example 2, we have more ambitious vocabulary. The language techniques have actually been constructed with the use of ambitious vocabulary, We have a reasonable amount of high-level vocabulary that has been spelled correctly, and it actually has created quite effective imagery. Now, in terms of our next lesson, we're going to be going over the following things. So we're going to recall how to approach paper 2. We're going to understand the structure of key questions, and we're going to apply our understanding to the exam questions. Now, if you need any additional support or help, the new videos will be added every single week. Alternatively, you can leave us a comment below or visit our partner channel Bookworm Teaching for more lessons and guidance on all things English. If you made it this far, guys, thanks ever so much, and all the best with your work and revision in the future. Bye bye.